Hi everyone. So as usual, I'm going to begin by acknowledging country. So I invite you wherever you are in this planet, in this earth, to notice that you are being breathed, that the great breath of things is moving through you, and that because that is true and that is a fact, we are somewhere. We are somewhere very specific. Each of us is somewhere very specific. I happen to be 4 or 5 days into being in Yagara, Jagara, and Turrbal country, which is a region, a place that I have lived many times, though I no longer live here. And I acknowledge the elders of these peoples who still exist. I acknowledge their elders past and present. I acknowledge the sciences and the songlines and the dreaming and the old people and the cultures and the big boss spirits who all make up the sovereignty of this place, of the great river, of the valley, of the mountains of this place. And I am deeply, deeply in awe and in deep listening as much as I can be, as much as I aspire to be to this place now in all its becoming. And I acknowledge that colonization happened and is still happening, and that that is what we exist in here in so-called Australia. And in the face of all of that, First Nations cultures still exist, struggle, survive, and also innovate and thrive as Indigenous cultures always adapt and evolve. And I acknowledge all of this and more. And I invite my friend Mara to do the same for where she is.
Hello. Well, I'm currently sat here in what is now Chester in Cheshire, which sits on a border, on a crossroads, which is also interesting because I'm literally on a crossroad right now between various streets. But this place sits on the border between modern day Wales, Cymru, and England. So if I look out my window in front of me, I can see over to the hills of Wales, I can see over to North Wales. And on a very clear day, we can see all the way over to Eryri. And yet, behind me, if I were to go into the next room and look behind me, the view is towards Afon Dyfrdwy, the River Dee, a river which flows through both England and Wales as well, another crossroad place, but also a river that has a long history of being connected to the way in which the peoples of this region and the various peoples that have come and made this region what it is interacted with the landscape and with the divine. So, the easiest way in which I can illustrate that is by telling you that just up the road from the river is a shrine to the goddess Minerva, brought here, of course, by the Romans when they came here and they settled here. But then, if we follow the river, there are also the remains of shrines to more native goddesses, more native spirits. The River Dee in itself, or Avon Dyfrdwy, its name is said to derive from the word dawn, Danu. So our native goddess Dawn is associated with that river. But so too is the goddess Eirven, a goddess of the fate of conflict and battle, a goddess who weaves the fates with when it comes to conflict. And then also follow the river towards Wales, towards Cymru, and you end up in Llyn Tegid, where Ceridwen and her brood live. And so I acknowledge all of those deities who are associated with the waters that flow through this place. But I also acknowledge that this is a landscape that has been peopled, has been populated by peoples of all sorts of different cultures and different backgrounds for absolute centuries, including my own background, which of course is Cymru, Cymraeg. So in Welsh, we call this place Caer. And yes, I acknowledge the spirits of this place and the crossroad nature of this strange liminal place that now sits on borders and yet has always been part and package of this specific sacred landscape.
Thank you so much. I love inviting people to acknowledge country. That's what we call it here. Because I feel like what it does, like so often I think in modern, like Western practice, like polytheistic, pagan, magical practice, there's this step that is skipped. It's like, oh, we turn up, we're here. Like, not always. Some groups really do this. Some individuals really do this. But there's often, I've noticed, we turn up, we're just going to do our thing, and we're going to do our ritual, done. And then I'm like, but what about like a way to gather everyone's attention who might have come from both near and far to this very place. And all that has happened here and is going on here, because there's probably not really one place on this earth anymore that isn't touched by the effects of empire and colonization, and also beautiful tending and rigorous and complex interweaving of all of these people of various classes kind of turning up and relating, so I feel like that's really interesting. And I loved hearing you talk about all the water and some of like, some of those rivers I have been with and feel so privileged to have been with and like on some level related to. And the same with this region. There's this huge big brown snake river. Like if you look at Google Maps at a, you know, at a kind of snapshot of so-called Brisbane. Brisbane, I think all the cities here are named after colonial British men. That's why I try to like ignore those names. I think it was Governor Brisbane or something like that. But you see this big brown river, one of the names that I've been told by Aboriginal people here is Mhara, and it's just this big snake, and it's so gorgeous. But of course, when the colonizers came, it was clear. Now it's brown, you could see the bottom of it when they came. Um, that's what their journals say, and that's what, Aboriginal memory says, and it's not that long ago that that happened. Yeah, I mean, before we pressed record, you and I were talking about, I guess, living pretty privileged lives on some level, and then paying attention to the devastation around the planet. And I guess I'm wondering how you're like tending to your heart and also like working in ways of justice around what you're noticing.
Mm. Yeah, we were talking about how it's difficult because at the minute, we were saying for anyone listening before we hit record that, it's very easy at the minute knowing all the strange things that are going on in the world. And of course, a big part of that is because we currently live in a world that is so interconnected that we're constantly on our screens, we're
Hmm.
constantly looking at our phones and hearing news from all over the world, which is quite a new development in
Hmm.
humanity. We're used to hearing the struggles and the tribulations of our community and nearby communities, but now we notice and are aware of things that are going on across the globe, and it's really easy to spiral into that place of, well, what can I do? What can I do to actually enact any change at all? Is it all just hopeless? Is it all
Hmm.
just silly? And can I not do anything? And the importance of not letting yourself spiral into that place because of that privilege that we have to be able to spiral into that place.
Yeah, yeah,
Be able to sit there and go, oh, what can I do? Well, some people don't have a choice. They have to deal with what's going on. So,
yeah.
yeah, it's been something big on my mind lately, that whole idea of, what can we do? And I think I'm kind of veering constantly nowadays between the two places of, the best place that I can enact change is in my square mile, is by, talking to people, by signing petitions, by writing to my members of parliament as much as that might do, but also by trying to, build community, foster community in my area in hopes that that might spread then. And then also beyond that, trying to use my voice as much as possible to put myself out there, go to protests, be as active as I can in speaking up against things that I find unjust
Yeah.
entirely. So yeah, it's that kind of trying to figure out where we go and what to do, but not becoming complacent and not becoming silent and
Yeah.
overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah, which is so easy, I guess, because as you said, screens, bombardment, but also realistically, we still have so much space and time to put that away and live in a country or a space or a city or a town or a village that isn't being actively ravaged, mutilated, right? And so that's a lot of space. That's a lot of space. Like the litmus test for these things seems to be a bit skewed in our brains, I think at times, because our fetches, our animal souls, I think we feel on some level in threat because the fetch part of us isn't always able to intellectually conceive that what we're seeing or hearing is not coming at us, right? And then that shakes up this other stuff. But luckily, in the traditions I practice, we're at least a triple being. So there are other parts of us that are like, oh, but remember this and remember that. Like, so like there's other parts of us that can like redirect, I think, and especially as a spirit worker, I feel like that's what we practice. We practice how do I how do I become a lucid mover between the worlds? I was discussing with in another conversation I had with a friend, Suzanne Sterling, an amazing ritualist musician. We were talking about how the witch, yes, we are ecstatic, yes, we fly, yes, we go beyond the hedge, but we come back. That's a big, we know how to come back. We know how to bring it back. And that's actually a big part of the attraction to, like I love that part of the craft that we come back. And then I could more broadly kind of like throw out my awareness and consider how in many, I guess, pagan, I still feel funny about that word sometimes, but I guess pagan cosmologies or traditions, how we're so yes, we have stories and myths about the process of death and reincarnation or places of rest or places of like the underworld where we dissolve in cauldrons and get rewoven. We have all these stories and lore, which I love, but I love that we are so in general focused on just being here and now. This is our home, this land, this home, these ancestors, these descendants, these rivers, these mountains. Um, and this is our breath. These are the elements. We live here and now. We will die, but like let us like this is divine. This is sacred. This is holy. And that deep knowing and truth in me is what also provokes me and invites me into like activism and and engagement because I look at, regard like so many people are always like, oh, but you're like in the case of like Gaza or Palestine in specific, right? It's like but you're queer or you're trans or you're this, that, and the other, you're also not Muslim. Da, da, da. And I'm like, wow, how ridiculous that you're assuming all of these things about a group of people who are myriad, multiplex, and some of them aren't Muslim. And also, do you know what being Muslim means for different people? Because it's really different. Like just like this human thing around being propagandized and like being tricked into ideas about groups of people, whether it's Jews, Muslims, witches, trans people, gay people, where we're like told that this entire group of people acts this way, thinks this way, and it's anathema to us, whoever the us is, the ones with the institutional power, I guess. But yeah, I think that's what is like, I'm noticing, like, obviously now tr pe people in the Western world again, like people are so like trans people are so like considered to be, such a useful threat politically.
Yeah, we've been turned into weapons, it seems, in
Mhm.
order to try and help bring people together for a cause that, is mostly built on hate and
Yeah.
such, but they're using us as the scapegoat in order to try and draw people to them. And yeah, you see it all the time. It's here in the UK at the moment, a huge, huge, big thing that's going on right now, and one that's being kind of levied by political power is the way in which they are not only scapegoating trans people, queer people in general and such, but also utilizing the scapegoatification. Is that a word? I don't know.
Mm.
But the scapegoating of those who are coming here as refugees, those who are
Yeah.
seeking asylum and such. And these are the kind of the pieces that they are using in their games to try and gain votes and such. And it angers me quite a bit because it's working, unfortunately. And it's terrifying to see it working because it's exactly what the powers that be want. They want us fighting each other. They want us at each other's throats so
Mm.
that we never look up, so that we never turn to the ones that are actually making our life absolute crap.
Yeah.
I always try and remind people whether it's via my socials, whether it's in person at events and such, that is exactly what the powers that be want. They want you to be looking downwards towards people who are a huge minority, for
Mhm.
starters, people who have no power, no sway over society at
Mhm.
all,
Mhm.
whether it's, the poor, whether it's the queer people, whether it's immigrants and asylum seekers.
Yeah.
It's always those who have the least power that they want you to turn towards and look towards,
Yeah.
um, so that we don't rise up together in order to turn against those who have the wish to stamp their boot against us. And it's interesting to see the patterns that are happening across the world as well, how the rather, intense bigotry that's coming out from very far right groups and such are rising to power at the minute, or at least giving the veneer that they're rising into power. And it's rather scary. As a trans person, I can say that quite honestly, that it is incredibly scary, but it's also really frustrating to see people who would have more in common with queer people, more in common with the poor, more in common with the asylum seekers that are coming over here than they ever would with these
Mm.
billionaires at the top, falling for their lies, falling for
Mm.
things like that. Over in the United States, they've got people like Trump and such, but here we have people like Nigel Farage, who is
Yeah.
currently pushing the boundaries of trying to force people into finding villains, into finding evil people where they can be. And it intrigues me how short of a memory a lot of people have, because it's only recently that, we had the Brexit vote over here, and Nigel Farage was rather instrumental in pushing the idea that we would do better outside of the European Union. And it was found that he lied so much. He lied so much, and a big part of why he was pushing for it was because he would gain some kind of privilege from being outside of that system and such. And now people are turning to him again, despite all that. And it just
Yeah.
it's so, I don't know, frustrating to see the way in which we're spiraling towards these things. But it's also important, I think, at this time to look towards hopeful things as well,
Yeah.
to try and keep a little bit of the spirit of, the transgressor, the spirit of
Yeah.
that which fights against these systems that are at play, these power systems and such. And I think that is part and package of what we, as the witch, can do. We can fight these things on levels that a lot of people can't. And I think I take a little bit of hope in that.
Yeah, and as you have too, I'm sure, I have seen the effect of it. This brings me to a really interesting conversation that's been at the back of my mind, which is like, I actually saw Margaret Cho. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's like this like quite well-known Korean American comedian. She's for decades she's been out and queer, and recently she said, "Oh yeah, I identify as a witch." And do you think that the and that was surprising to me. But I was like, "Oh, go girl." And then she was like, "Do you think, all those bindings against Trump's, why didn't they work? And do you think there's like dark magicians, which is not how I would phrase it, but dark magicians who are like kind of battling?" And I was listening to this going, "Oh, these are conversations I have with witches all the time. We use slightly different, phrasing, but like something that has come up for me lately, I've had a lot of conversations with different spirit workers and witches in my life around big magic, but also little magic and effective sorcery and spirit work. And the thing that I'm constantly reminding people of is if it's a smaller field, so if you're casting a spell or doing magical work in a smaller pond where you're trying to get a job or draw in a lover or bless the crops or bind so and so over there in the, who's pissed you off or whatever, who's done something crabby or whatever, um, it's more likely if you've, worked the magic effectively that it will work because it's a smaller field with less collision of bigger forces. But when we are, trying to go for a well-protected, institutionally guarded person like a president, that's a different situation. It doesn't mean that you can't do those things. And when I think back to that very public, binding of Trump in the US in his first presidency, I was watching and I saw it work, even though I wouldn't have been so public about it. But then I know other groups, many people were doing things underneath too, like underground. But I saw it work. Like then this person, this sex worker, Stormy Daniels, rose up from nowhere, who is a witch, like an out witch, and what she said in her testimony did bring him down. And I watch how magic plays out over seasons and cycles. But now with the Epstein files, but there's this other thing that happens where yes, he does have Christian. He has like maniacal Christian war prayers who are so aware, who guard him, and I would argue, I wouldn't say they're working witchery, but they're working magic. Like they are magically firing back quite consciously at witches. They name us, they talk about us, they invoke their powers, whoever those powers are. Because I too pray to Michael and Uriel, and I'm like, I don't know. And I'm gonna act like a Christian right now and go, I don't know if that's who you're calling to. Because I'm just like, I don't know, whatever egregoric, demiurgic, strange spirit you're calling to. Um, but their magic is real too, right? And also, so is the colonial enterprise, the imperialist enterprise of the USA. That's all magic too. So these different collisions of egregores and consciousness, we have to take this all into account when we're enacting our magic. And I feel one of the cunning pieces of being a witch is that we can play a long game. We also know how to shapeshift. I always think about Starhawk, whose lineage I'm in, and she often talks about how when she would go out, and she still does, but when she would go with groups of protesters to like these different blockades and huge things, little things, they would do trance work in the middle of the street, drumming, blocking middle of the street, and they would turn into mice, and they would go into the fortress, and they would eat wires, and I'm like, yes, that's witchcraft, like you have to sometimes be the smallest, most invisible thing. And yeah, let the bigger things distract them, and then be turn into a tiny finch or turn into like a flea and then go into the fortress because only certain tiny invisible things can pass under their radar. So on some level, the active oppression, sidelining, persecution of many of the groups that you and I exist in, and many witches have a big Venn diagram, almost like pie with those groups. It's like, oh, you're going to ignore us anyway. So we actually, we're already so pushed out beyond the hedge anyway that we know how to hedge ride, and we know the languages of worms and birds, and we're going to work our age-old magic. Um, and so, I think I just am thinking about how, like what you said about as witches, we can find hope, but also we can find efficacy in what we do. And one of the reasons I'm constantly in awe of the craft is its efficacy. Like, like I'm like, wow, when you're really in it, and you're with your spirits, and you're with the land, the sky, the sea, you're with your souls, whatever. Wow, this magic just constantly blows my mind, and I'm just like in awe of it. And I trust it. But the thing is, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be that we're not going to be hurt, that the people we love aren't going to be hurt, that there isn't going to be collisions because these imperialist, colonialist forces are huge and they have so much hoarded power. They've stolen. It's all stolen. Like we could have a whole philosophical, ideological, political conversation about how that's all stolen. It is, and they've stolen it, and they know what they've done, and so they use that stolen, hoarded life force and power against the earth for their own benefit, their own investment, literally investment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the strange truth of it is that a lot of our myths, our legends, our traditions, and even, some of the more kind of very popular arts and such within occultism and magic today, they tell us that in order for true rebirth to happen, in order for us to fully gain a new perspective and move on and shift to a new place, things have to die, things have to crumble first. And I think, sometimes we forget that, and we forget that, it's not always going to be this very kind of 1980s idea of entering into the age of Aquarius where, we're going to gather around a campfire and sing Kumbaya with each other.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think when we come to these places where we start to see justice being enacted in a much kind of more efficient way and in a way that is more clear to us, we're going to also have to deal with seeing things die. And I have a lot of conversations with the witches in my life about how a lot of witches are not that they want justice. They want to try and kind of deal with the injustices that are going on in the world, but a lot of them are not willing to deal with the crumbling that might come with that in the
Yeah.
process. Because,
Yeah.
a lot of us, especially here in the West, we have become accustomed to the privileges and to the comforts that we've been granted and given. And the idea that we have to kind of deal with the fact that all of this is built on a system that isn't working, that is
Mhm.
just not working, and that perhaps in order to step into something greater, it needs to die and it needs to
Mhm.
crumble first. And when I look to my own culture with that, I see the stories of like Ceridwen and such, that idea that she was sent into this chase propelled by her sacred rage, which is something that I always try and remind people of, because there is this tendency, especially in witching circles, especially with witches that are very new to the craft and such, that there is this tendency to go down that very new agey route of thinking that love and light and peace is the only way forward. And I have to remind them, well, a lot of our goddesses, a lot of our deities, they allowed themselves to feel their rage, their sacred rage, and that rage allowed them to create and birth something
Mhm.
rather beautiful. And that story in and of itself, the story of Taliesin's birth, which involves this incredible transformative chase and such, could be viewed and read in some ways as almost a tale of initiation. It's
Mhm.
giving us the core basics of initiation. And in order to birth this greatest bard, in order for this bard to be born and initiated into the mysteries, someone else had to die first, that
Mhm.
the person that they were formerly had to die. And so many of our mysteries, so many of our traditions, so many of our myths seem to echo that idea that things need to die in order for things to regrow, for things to be brought into life. And I wonder sometimes what needs to die in order for us to move forward. And the easy way is to kind of be very insensitive about it and to try and imply that the harm that's being caused to queer people, to minorities, to people in Gaza at the minute and such, that is part of the process of dying. But I don't think that that is what's going on. I
Yeah,
think
I agree.
that is the other side fighting back,
Yes.
essentially. To
Yes.
me, it's the whole mindset of where we are and who we are as humanity needs to die, if anything, in order for us to move forward. And a lot of people just aren't willing to try and focus on that. And I'm saying that as somebody who also is, struggling with the ability to accept that the world in which we live in does not work and is built on
Yeah.
a system that is made to oppress, that is made to look down upon us. And
Yeah.
nobody's benefiting really. And yet we're taught to believe that we are.
Yeah, it's such a game. It's such a horrifying game. Yeah, I'm thinking about also the cross, well, we don't always have to think about it this way, but like the hinge, of the wheel that you and I are at, and I'm here in, below the equator, but I guess that's from the perspective of the north, but and you're above the equator, and so you're in, I don't know what word you'd use for this hinge.
Oh gosh, I'm not sure either.
Yeah. So here I would say, I mainly use the Irish words and the English words. So I would say like Imbolc and Candlemas. And when I use those words, I'm aware they're different feasts, but I also am aware that they happen pretty much at the same time. I'm kind of actively I'm actively drawing upon like medieval English liturgical kind of folk Catholic traditions, and I'm also drawing upon what we know of and what I feel of Irish, Irish Imbolc. So I'm curious, like what you're noticing Like what is there like a Cymraeg festival now? Like around the late July, early August? Do you have a name for that?
Yeah, so at this time of year, we enter into what we call in Welsh Awst, which is the name of the month, August. It comes from the
Okay.
same root as the Latin word. But the word that we use for this specific period as we're moving into this now is Calan Awst, and we move
Hmm.
into Gwyl Awst. And, the word Awst has a lot to do with reaping and harvesting and
Mm.
such, coming to that place. And yeah, it's a complicated one because, like I said, I don't know what I'd call it either
Mm.
because a lot of these terms that we've kind of associated with it come from either a culture that we don't have as much connection with
Yeah.
or from very kind of Christian traditions and
Yeah.
such. So, there's been lots of conversations over here lately
Yeah.
because the common word that's used by pagans
Mm.
over here, in the UK and Ireland is Lunasa.
Hmm.
Um, and there's a lot of kind of conversations going on right now with, well, that term is specifically associated with the god Lu, and
Yes.
if you are somebody who practices a form of paganism, magic, witchcraft that does not involve that god, why are you calling it that name?
Yeah.
The Feast of Lu, So yeah, it's a complicated one. We have our own version of Lu in
Yeah.
of Lugos Lu in Wales, and it's Lleill. So I suppose we could call it the Feast of Lleill here in Wales. But yeah, it's a complicated one.
Yeah, I remember 20 years ago when I was in the Coven of the Wildwood, and we were grappling with our inheritance of the threads that we were with and the witchcraft tradition that we had touched. And we were like, I remember someone in the early coven was saying, wait, why do we call these festivals these names? Should we consider trying to find our own names? And I remember two of us, and I could be argued out of this, but two of us said, look, our like what we like this is complicated because we could come up with new names to make ourselves feel both better and less messy and more focused. But there's something to me, I'm a Scorpio moon. I love being in the mess. And there's something to me about acknowledging that what we're inheriting, what we're weaving with, what we're doing does have these roots. Like it does have these cultural roots, but is also romanticized, is also colonized, is also Christian. And as like personally, I have no issue with that. I know lots of witches and pagans who do, and that makes a lot of sense. But I feel like for me, my kind of practice has always allowed for the reality that, especially in the Celtic countries, that there was both violent Christianity, but also another form, which kind of like, we kind of easily go, oh, dual faith, and maybe that's kind of a misnomer, but like a weaving or an integration or or a syncretism that happens both actively but also over decades and centuries, where you're left with things like St. Bridget's Day or St. Kieran's Well or St. Nectan's Glen or and you come, and even though that might be uncomfortable, it's also our history. And
Mm.
so for me, I'm trying, like I did spend a good few years trying to be a Hellenic polytheist reconstructionist. And I was being really purist about it. But alongside that, I was also practicing the craft as I knew it, which does have, for better or worse, ties to English culture and traditions, and by which I mean like a complex mismatch of liturgical, Catholic, Protestant, weird, cunning, and then Irish and da 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 da. And so I just want to kind of be with that. Like I want to be with the truth of that. I don't want to make up a history. And really, the more have researched and looked through that frame, the more I see continuity. It's just that continuity isn't what we were taught it was 25, 30 years ago. Like it was never a pre-Christian pagan priesthood devoted to the great goddess and her horned consort. What a lovely idea, but also actually not for me. And I'm more into this idea of, and I know most people don't believe that at all, but I'm more into this idea of things having been passed, yes, discreetly, but also really culturally. And also, people on the land are people on the land, and some of them are still really aware. Like, I've had encounters in those islands that you live in where I'm just walking around and I happen upon a farmer in his field, and he's like, what are you looking for?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm looking for this very particular monument or barrow mound, which happens to be on his giant land that he's probably inherited for centuries." And I'm like, and he's like, "Oh, let me tell you a story about that." And I'm like, and then he tells me this fairy story about it. And I'm like, and that's not uncommon. So like I always try to tell people these stories because I'm like, people don't forget these meaningful things. They don't forget them, and maybe sometimes they forget the ritual purpose or the cosmological specificity, but it's all still there. And that reminds, and I think I've come to that perspective now because when I go back to Bali, which is, my indigenous culture that is intact, where I'm from, where I was born, my father's like deeply involved. When I go there, which is an actively animistic, polytheistic, spirit working culture that confronts every Western person that goes to it, they're like, "Whoa, whoa." Like, they're just like, especially pagans and witches, like, "I can't believe this is happening." I'm like, "Oh yeah, we do this all the time." Um, and and I'm just like that, we think of ourselves as Hindu, but recently I've discovered that that is actually quite an interesting, like, kind of, we were told we were Hindu by Dutch people who colonized us and basically said, "Well, you had Hindu empires, come through here, and then you pray to these gods, and those are Sanskrit names, so you're definitely Hindu." But then when you look at Balinese cosmology and tradition, yeah, we have many Vedic and Indian influences, but we're Balinese and we have Balinese traditions. So, yes, we're Hindu, but yes, we're also animistic.
Yeah, I think when it comes to this time of year as well, going back to that idea of the hinge, it's interesting to look at what's going on here right now because we're entering into autumn. Autumn is just around the corner for us, so we're kind of preparing for that, and that's what this time of year is all about for us. So that hinge of Calanawst, as we would call it in Wales. It's that time where, it's preparing for the darkness that is ahead, preparing for the cold that we're about to have, and harvesting all that you have sown, essentially. So I always have a deep struggle with this time of year because I feel sometimes really inauthentic within it all. Because whilst on one hand, we can take those uh, core ideas, that core idea of this is a time of harvest, this is a time of, reaping what you sow and all of that, that there is this tendency in paganism nowadays to look at that as almost like a psychological thing or a deeply spiritual thing where, we're reaping the rewards of our deep inner work and things like this. And I struggle with that sometimes because I'm like, well, at its core, really, if we overlook the more romanticized modern ideas of what this time of year represents, this time of year was very much rooted in the connection that people had to the landscape and the way in which they interacted with and saw the changes going on in that landscape around them. And I've always struggled with how I marry that with my own beliefs and my own practice because I am not a farmer. I am not somebody who works the land. I'm not somebody who goes out there. I'm very much descended from people who did that. My grandfather owned a very large farm on Anglesey, on Ynys. He only just recently died. So this year, I think, because he just recently died, is very much a time I'm really thinking about this. And whilst I went to his farm and helped him sometimes, I would never claim that I was a farmer and that I, did any of these big tasks that the farmers were very much in need of doing at this time. We rely on the people who do work the land. We rely on the food that they can provide and such. But in the modern day, we're almost disconnected from that tradition because whilst in the past the farmers would have put out a call saying, "I need help. Please come help me harvest, the grain, get things ready for autumn." And the community would answer that call and they would go and work for him or them. And they would very much, be part and package of the way in which the land gave us the sustenance that we needed to survive the harsher months ahead. Nowadays, we're disconnected from that because we can walk down to the supermarket, and whilst we're still reliant on farming, still reliant on those who work on the land, we don't have that same connection of knowing where our produce comes from, knowing, who grew it and such. And so this time of year, I'm always in this constant debate of how I connect to all of that when I'm not somebody who has that experience of being hands-on with the landscape, of doing those very tough things. And but I do, in many ways, find a lot of solace in looking at the traditions. And like you were saying, there is some echo of something rather ancient and magical underpinning all of these traditions. So, as I was saying, at its core, this is a time to acknowledge the work that needs to be done, the way in which we tended to the land, the way we were in relationship with the landscape around us. But there was always also this almost spiritual component which transcends the very Christian nature of this landscape that has been here for, hundreds upon hundreds of years now, embedded into the very culture of this land. And yet, amidst that, we have sources from the 1800s, the 1700s, when it was very much still a Christian nation that seems to showcase this belief in a spirit that is associated with the land itself. In Cymru, in Wales, we have a concept associated with this time of year, which in some parts of Wales is referred to as a gasegfedi. So a gasegfedi translates to the harvest mare, and the idea is that when we're reaping the bounty of the landscape, we are interacting with a spirit that is alive, that everything we are touching is alive and spirited, which in and of itself is almost an animistic belief that, the land is alive, the grain is alive, and it has a spirit, and it takes the form within folk tradition of a mare, a horse, basically, and that horse represents the very power and sovereignty of the land, which is very interesting when you look back at some of the oldest, like Celtic mythologies and such. Horses, sovereignty, horses on the land seem to have this deep connection, and then there's this folk tradition that carried on and was still very much a part and package of culture until the mid 20th century. It's only very recently that that started to die out with very industrialized forms of farming and such. In other parts of Wales, it was referred to as a gwrach. A gwrach is it literally translates to mean hag, so like a hag-like figure, but in modern Welsh language, it's become synonymous with the idea of the witch. So it's almost like this idea that the spirit of the land is this witch hag-like figure who is very much the embodiment of the bounty that the landscape can provide us. And it's really interesting to see those little things that are just hidden in plain sight almost, that seem to recall this belief that we are constantly in relationship with that which is around us, and that we are in community as well with it. Not just that we, interact with it and have power over it in any way, but that we are in community with it, and that we rely upon that power as much as we rely on the power of our own human community as well. And I love that. I love finding those things. And like you, I think it's much more authentic to be able to look at these things for what they are and kind of see them as the broader picture of what's going on, rather than trying to come up with some very strange mythopoetic idea of what could have been, I suppose.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. I think so when I like come to a feast, like a celebration of one of these feasts, I often, if I'm given the job of like doing the like welcome and attention or the declaring statement that we often do at the beginning of rituals, right? You know, I often will say, the stories I know about these ancient festivals are this. And then I'll say, and this is the world we live in, and it's really complicated. And let us be with that. Like, so like everything you just said, where you're talking about, I don't know how to relate to harvest necessarily in this way, even though, did you say your grandfather or your father?
My
Your
grandfather.
grandfather who's recently died had this farm, and, previously the community would help. And it's like, yeah, and that's not so long ago. And now we live in this like place where it's all about convenience and quickness and like there's the supermarket. And even though a large percentage of that food does come from the land. Yes, so heavily industrialized, deeply harmful, poisonous, polluting potentially. But this is our food that gives us sustenance, you know. So it's kind of all still there, but it's like again, it's the collision of all these forces, and I feel like the truth of being someone who observes the changing seasons and cycles as they change and are torn and impacted by climate crisis, which again is a collision of capitalism, industrialization, colonialism. So like it's like I feel like we just have to turn up and go, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. And yet while this is happening, the trees still are here. You know, these flowers still bloom maybe a bit kind of differently than before, but they're still here. You know, the birds are less, but we still see them and we protect them, or we try to, or this group protects them. Let's give them money. Like, you know, like let's learn about these berries that grow here, and do we have access to those berries anymore? You know, what native orchids where I am are like able to be met and encountered in the bush at what time of year. So to me, I'm always my answer to all of those when I hear confusion, I'm like, hey, all of it, all of it. Like let's remember that yes, like not so long ago and in the ancient past at Bealtaine or Rudemass or whatever it was, you know, whatever that hinge of the year was, some pastoral peoples would drive their cows between certain fires and you know they would do this and they would do that. And up until recently, you know, some communities still light fires at these times of year. Maybe they don't exactly know why, but you know, but pastoral agricultural communities still have things that happen in certain seasons. So there's harvest, there's lambs happening, there's cows. People still got that going on. I remember a friend of mine, she lives here, but she discovered her was it her was it her grandfather or father? Now, it was one of them through like ancestry.com or 23andMe, and she had never known who her biological parent was in that case, and she flew over to somewhere in, I believe, Somerset or Devon, and she's a pagan, and she met this community of people. They were, you know, ostensibly Christian, but at the cross quarters, at the fire festivals, which I also know is somewhat of a misnomer, but at those times of year, they all gathered in the center of their village and lit a fire. And they said, you know, when she asked, "Oh, we've always done this." You know, and you know, and I know those people, those communities still exist. And in Bali too, like where it's so rapidly becoming developed and the young people are like working on cruises and like trying to make money and like tourism is so devastating Bali and but the rice farming, like Bali is also known for the beautiful rice, you know, the UNESCO heritage listed, whatever that means, rice terrace fields, the Sawi Inda, the beautiful fields. Um, and our way of farming and being with the rice, who is a goddess. The rice is Devi Sri, she is the goddess. And so a lot of our indigenous festivals, while there's a Hindu element to them, they're really old. You know, the Balinese year is a 210-day cycle, which is the rice cycle. And even though maybe Balinese rice harvests don't happen in exactly the same way they used to, and even though many, many people do not farm anymore, there are farmers everywhere. Like you can't be on that island and not see a rice field. Like and you can't not see the shrines in the fields filled with offerings. And you cannot see the way that people still, even in busy cities, lay out the rice on the side of the road to dry under the sun. So, so it's like this is all there in the mix of it, and I feel like the wreckage of empire, because I believe we're in the wreckage of empire, and I feel like witches are really kind of born to kind of dance in that. Um, and I feel like, you know, and you know, all kinds of other different spirit workers too, not just witches, but
Mhm.
but we're able to, I think one of our charges, I believe one of our charges is to be with the whole mess and
Mhm.
to remind people of how things were, but not necessarily in a romantic way, and then to remind people of what things could be like. It's
Mhm.
like we're like vision holders, we're poetry stirrers, and we're kind of provocateurs. We're like, back to your transgressive piece. We say, hey, you know, it could be like this. And maybe it never was like this, but it could be like this. And we could be meeting all of us and lighting beautiful fires and jumping over it. We could be doing that. We could be meeting at the ocean side and singing these songs and drumming for hours and nights even. We could be doing that. How beautiful, how joyful, how wondrous. And we could be a society, and of course you don't have to do that, but you're welcome to come. And we could be a society of pluralism where Sikhs gather here and Jews gather here and Christians are over there and witches are doing this, and we all hang out with each other too, because I have hung out with all of those groups of people in their places of worship doing interfaith work. So I know we can do it because some of us do it. But yeah, there's still this idea that we can't share our traditions and that we can't share wisdom, but I actually think we can. There are so many examples of different kinds of people coming together and going, this is what my people do, or this is what I do. I'm so curious. Do you do something right now? Or when do you do things that are important?
Yeah, and it's something that I've noticed from what little travel I have done, because I'm not as well traveled as some people are, but I have traveled a little. And from what travel I've done, it's really interesting to kind of see the vast difference that seems to exist from these really heated conversations that happen within the microcosm that is the internet spaces, especially within witchcraft, polytheistic, pagan communities. There's big conversations happening right now to do with gatekeeping and cultural appropriation, and they're really important conversations to be having. And people are kind of letting the pendulum swing a little too far sometimes with some of these conversations, where it's become now so heated that it's people are scared to approach a lot of things because they're like, what if I do something wrong? What if I am encroaching on something? And on one hand, I love that people are becoming more kind of compassionate towards the idea that they could be stepping into something here that they shouldn't be, and as such might be seen as disrespectful if they do step into it. I love that they're giving space to people who are part of cultures that are very much living, and it's something that I struggle with sometimes because they do it with my culture. The amount of people I get who message me and go, well, I want to learn more about Welsh mythology, Welsh magic, Welsh everything. Is it a closed practice? Can you please tell me whether or not I'm allowed to do this? And on one hand, it's like, oh my gosh, I love that you're asking. And I think that is the way forward, is to ask, this culture of consent. But on the other hand, I'm like, has the conversation become so heated within the space that is the online spaces, that people are now terrified to even approach other people who might do things differently to them and see how things might be done in a different way. And yet when you come out of those internet spaces, when you come out of kind of those very specific kind of social platforms and such, and you instead enter into the world and you go off and you interact with people, there is a very different story that seems to go on. And I've loved how whenever I have traveled, wherever it has been, recently I traveled over to the United States and I met people who had traveled for these different events that I attended from all over as well. I also have traveled to Southeast Asia and such in the past. And I love the way in which sometimes somebody will ask me, tell me something about your culture. So tell me something about you and the way in which you do things. And I'll sit there and I'll think, oh God, what am I going to say now? Because that thing happens, doesn't it? When someone tells you to tell them something about yourself, you suddenly forget everything that even exists in your mind about yourself. But usually my go-to is to tell a story. And so I'll find a folk tale or a myth or a story or something of some kind, and I'll tell that story. And I love the way that whenever I've done that, whenever I've gone, well, here's a folk story or a myth from Wales. I love when somebody from another culture, you'll just see their eyes kind of widening as I'm telling the story, and they'll go, no, you stole that. You must have stolen that because we have that exact story, except in our version, this happens instead of this. And I love that. I love that the way in which we can connect over things that are similar. And it's like you were saying, that whole idea of like, oh, is it this? Is it that? Could it be this? And it's everything. It's all of it all at once. And it's one of the reasons that I personally have such a love and a fondness for places like the ancient monuments that we have here on this island. So the way, so specifically, if I go to my island that I grew up on, Ismorn, Anglesey, there is a quite a large collection of ancient monuments that date back far into prehistory that dot the coastal line, which tells us how long people have occupied these places, have lived in these places, and interacted with the landscape here. And often will get kind of criticized, critiqued as modern pagans in these areas, in these landscapes, for using and having a connection to these sacred monuments, these ancient monuments. Because, for us, especially people like me who grew up speaking Cymraeg, Welsh, the native language of this region, when we practice our polytheism and our magic and our witchcraft and such, we do it through the lens of a kind of Celtic culture, of a culture that comes under the umbrella of Celtic stuff. And these ancient monuments, they're not Celtic. They are much older than that. They are the remnants of cultures that existed here even before Celtic culture made its way over to these shores. So we'll sometimes get criticized and we'll get told, why do you go to Bryn Cyhythu or Barclodi de Gawres or these places on the solstices and the equinoxes and such when they had nothing to do with the Celtic people, when they had nothing to do with the culture that you specifically talk about right now? And I'll always challenge that and go, why would you believe that it has nothing to do with Celtic culture? They were there when much before the Druids or the Celts or any of those peoples were on these lands, but they were still standing when those people came. And there is very much proof that we interact with those spaces now. We love to go there, whether it's to study the history of our people, whether it's to study the history of our landscape, whether it's to go and celebrate the summer solstice and such. We interact with those ancient monuments. So why would we believe that they did not interact with those monuments as well? Why would we assume that there was no interaction going on with the peoples that have constantly shifted and evolved and, moved with the places? But these stones, these monuments, these beautifully sacred places stood there regardless of what changes were going on in the landscape among the people, among the human people. So why would they not have some connection to our Celtic ancestors as well? And, I think that's one of the reasons I do love those ancient monuments is because they've stood there, stones, remembering and witnessing all of these changes, like sentinels or guardians throughout it all. And they connect us through these different stages of people. So whether we're talking about, the very earliest of people who built them for whatever reason we might not know, or whether we're talking about groups like the Druids and various other Celtic tribes who might have interacted with them, we don't know, possibly. Archaeology seems to imply that they at least visited them, if not interacted with them. And then we have, as we enter into later periods and such, we know that the very much instrumental people in the fields of archaeology and also in fields like Neo-Druidry, they interacted with them during the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and now we're here today interacting with them as well. And I think they're the perfect metaphor for the way in which something can be one thing, but also everything all at once. It doesn't have to be locked in this very rigid kind of view of it. We can look at things in a much more kaleidoscopic way.
Yes, kaleidoscopic, absolutely. Yeah, that's so, I love that. And I just think about how our understanding is so limited. The models that we have been offered by these amazing researchers are models of history, models of physics, models, and they're not the thing, you know? They're meant to help us orient. And so when we even say Celtic, or when we say prehistory, or when we say monument, we are like that's not what we're talking about. You know, like, yes, all of these things also exist on some level through certain frameworks, but like, I doubt the Celtic peoples said that of themselves. You know, they probably said, these are my grandparents, these are my, these are my hills, this is the name of my tribe. Maybe they'd say that, like, and so it's like very similar to how. Like, I think it's a useful term now in the same way, like maybe certain people find the term Aboriginal sometimes useful, even though it's a colonized term. Um, but it can point at like political issues or historical cultural complexes and things like that. I think that's really interesting. And I think when and also another layer to add to every layer you added is that the folk record shows that people we would accuse that the culture at the time accused of being witches gathered at some of those monuments. We know that the folk record and the folklore says, oh, at the Rollright Stones, witches gathered. At this place, witches were. And so, what does that mean? And who was watching? And what kind of things did they do there? And again, we have, trial records that discuss at least, some of what the cultural popular consciousness was thinking was going on. But that is also deeply impacted by the land, the land and actual magical practice as much as I guess demonological narrative, which is also impacted by the land and magical practice. So I just think all of we kind of have to like sift our way through the whole thing. And I kind of love how like like from coming into the craft like really earnestly 1999 2000, that was those years, and like reading those books, and then quite quickly the conversations changed, and I was like riding that wave, and I have such an interest in history and folklore that I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. And then also coming from a culture that was so alive and vivid and magical, I was able to have a different perspective on a few things that kind of helped my mind with it, because I would see something that someone would say, oh, okay, let's like a good example is the Yule tree. The Christmas tree is pagan because of ding dong dang, all these things. And I'm like, huh, how fascinating. Like, what do we mean when we say that? What is pagan? What is Christian? What culture did this come from? What is a Yule log? What, like, and being able to kind of go, and all of it somehow coalesces into this practice that has existed for like, I don't know, like, is it 500 or 700 years, but connects to other clear practices of, greenery at the midwinter time, the pine and its ancient roots and iconography and mythology and all of these cultures for like regenerative, maybe not James Fraser dying rising gods, but something along those lines, right? So I just think you can't people who go, oh, that's wrong because of this, are often also only using one layer. That I feel like we really have to look at all of this and go, there's folklore, there's archaeology, there's songs, there's fairy stories, there's the land itself who has agency, by the way. There's the spirits and the gods who have agency. There's the evolving communities of witches, magicians, spirit workers, occultists, Christians, nominal, otherwise, you know. And then when we think of Britain, all of the invading forces, the imperialist forces, and then all of the kind of like migratory, settling, uh, invading forces too. I don't know how people thought about the Angles and the Utes and the. I don't know how that was. I don't know what that was like. I don't know what it was like for Vikings to come, but and then you have this island of many names and many peoples and many languages being so filled by all these gods, Minerva, you mentioned Minerva before, Isis, like, and and then no wonder the traditions that spring out of that island, and not just that island, but I'm kind of only focusing now on that island, are just so like pluralistic and syncretic, And then of course, if you went to a far corner of Cornwall, depending on where you were, maybe you'd hear weird legends about a Phoenician goddess. I think that's really fascinating about that island, and it does show that is actually, that is part of my cultural inheritance and my magical inheritance, and I think about it a lot. Even though I live in Australia, and Australia only exists in the form we think of it because of literal British colonization. So I think about it in all those ways, and I think about even those stories like that some early Gardnerian witches were enamored by, like Brutus and Troy and Diana, and all of that stuff, like these stories that British culture tells itself around its like noble roots, things like that.
Yeah, and it's I think it's why it's important in this conversation we have about like decolonization and such that we kind of accept what places like Britain are not try and create something different about it. There's a lot of people out there right now who very nobly are trying to kind of draw from all of these different sources some form of kind of indigenous spirituality to this place that we can kind of tie it down very easily. But I always kind of question, what does that even mean? By now, especially, like, who are the indigenous people of this island? How far back are we going? Who exactly are we calling it? I have people often saying to me, "You're an indigenous person of this island," and I always feel like I don't know what that means when you say it, because I get it, because I speak a language that derived from one of the oldest languages that was tied to this place that existed long before a lot of the very kind of primary invading forces came and created the culture that we know today. And yet, that culture arrived here after another culture was here first and such. So it's all so complicated. And I think it's important to be able to see this island as the weird cauldron that it is, with all of these different elements that have made it what it is, in order to be able to understand what's going on today better as well. So, like, as I referenced at the beginning, a huge issue we're facing right now here on the political level and such, in the political landscape, is the way in which that certain groups of people are being turned into a weapon in order for certain figures within our politics to gain some kind of standing. And in particular, the big conversation right now is surrounding asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants. So people who are coming here from elsewhere. And I think it's a strange one when we see this obsession that there is nowadays with trying to put this idea that, we should put Britain first and put the British first, when we have always been an island that is comprised of various cultures, various languages, various peoples. We have always been that way, and it's never ever changed. So why are we fighting so hard against it now and trying to deny that? And I think there's something rather magical about being able to accept that for what it is. But a lot of people, I think, are too scared to, because that means that if we can't blame the people who are arriving here on boats for all the issues that we're currently facing, then who can we blame? And maybe, if we actually answer that question truthfully, it might show us that perhaps we need to upend an entire system, which is a lot scarier than trying to, upend the lives of people that are far weaker and far less privileged than we are. It's all very complicated, and I think it's part and package of what makes us who we are today.
Yeah, that's wild. And again, back to your point about like not looking up, right? Like, wait, what systems of power over and oppression and who are the cheerleaders of those systems and the perpetuators, the active kind of invested perpetuators, and how complicit am I with that? Oh, da 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 da. It's just wild when I think about that. And, wild that I'm having this conversation with you, so far away in your ancestral lands colonized by what we think of as Britain. Like, what a strange concept, right? Britain is such a strange concept. And then this place that I'm in, that I was not born in this land, my mother was, and some of her ancestors were, but most were not, and how it was stolen, by the British Empire. And that is true. Like, there are lots of people here who really deny that. Like, and I would say, wow, grow up. Like, like it's just true, and you're gonna have to relate with the truth of that in some better way. Like, rather than being like, well, I guess this means that white people are stronger than indigenous people. And of course, they wouldn't use that word, indigenous. They'd say something else more abhorrent, terrible, you know. And I'm just like, wow, you're just the very bastion of white supremacy. But it's just like, it's just wild that sometimes when I think about witchcraft and I think about how there's a few things I think about with witchcraft. I think, God, why? Like, we're using an English word, and I know you discuss this a lot in your work. We're using an English word, but it's actually the word we've got. This is our common colonial language, unfortunately. It is what it is. That's where we're at. This is the word. It's witch. And when I hear people say, oh, because there's like lots of communities of color who for centuries the colonizers would say all of their traditions were witchcraft. And now some of them will, and have for honestly centuries, called themselves witches or use those cognate words, bruja or brujo, or to mean that what yeah, I do magic. I do this transgressive, dangerous magic. Yeah, I do that. Um, and it's like now, like there are certain people in modern witchcraft communities that would say, well, that's not witchcraft because it's not from Britain. And I'm like, girl, like you don't get to say that. Also, the history of an English word is really complicated. The English language is really complicated. And any group of people who've been forced to speak English get to use whatever words they want.
Mhm.
You know, and also I do think witchcraft is a crossroads word. It's inherently a crossroads word. And so much of what modern day witches, a lot of what we do, a lot of what I do, I can trace right back to your culture and my ancestors' cultures from those islands. Again, some of it very romanticized, some of it not so romanticized, some of it passed in a really strong folk way. But when I think about the USA, because I'm part of two traditions that emerged in the USA, reclaiming and fairy, and I think about their roots and their cauldron of complexity and colonization, and a lot of the magic we're taught, and that's written in things like Buckland, even like that's hoodoo, it's conjure, like this color candle for this herb for this, and it's like who that's hoodoo. Like it's specifically hoodoo. And again, there's actually nothing wrong with that. Let's just be honest about it. And like if depending on who you are or what, who you are, where you are born, because like lots of white people practice hoodoo in the South. Like again, like so this idea of puritanical lines of race, ethnicity, culture. Well, actually, it's more about culture, isn't it? Like it's more about who are you? It's not about what color skin you are. It's about what culture are you in? What language do you speak? Where do you live? And if hoodoo or Southern conjure or whatever you call that is a part of your practice, and then that somehow ends up in contemporary witchcraft traditions in the USA, which passes through Llewellyn in books that we read in Wales and Australia that says the blue is for this, you know, and we inherit in that moment, not inherit, but we are influenced in that moment by hoodoo. So I think we really need to always just be open to like be so curiously open to the immense fuckery of the world, but also the beauty of these magical traditions. Because at the end of the day, these magical traditions they come up from the ground. They come up from the ground and they're peasant stock magic, and it's magic of the people, and it's magic of the collective, and it's magic that really helps people survive, and also sometimes magic that helps us thrive. And so that's powerful that we're collecting that. But again, I think we just need to be sensitive and aware and mindful of who is most benefiting sometimes from these things. Who are the voices that we hear from a lot? Like I cast my attention. You and I think, are in some ways good examples of voices that we don't always get to hear from a lot, like you're Welsh, you're Cymraeg, and I'm like biracial. I hate that term. I'm a person of color, queer, trans, Australian. Like this is not common in the which like we see a lot of like male white faces, and that's who we hear from. And occasionally we get to hear from like women. But like, I just am like I'm more interested in like and like, who are the voices that, and I think, that's why in the last 15 years of me being a public witch in publishing, I've experienced a lot of pushback from a lot of people because I'm bringing up some issues that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. And I'm also speaking from a crossroads of perspective that not a lot of people in modern witchcraft possess.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, like being from like a Balinese culture and like a settler culture. I'll call it that. But yeah, like, and again, a lot of people in witchcraft wouldn't even say that. They wouldn't say settler culture. And I know the consciousness is evolving, but I'm here to be annoying and transgressive and provocative.
Yeah, I think something that I always kind of struggle with is, I am very much, I come to this space as a white person who has certain privileges and such because of that, and yet it's strange to me and mind-boggling to me that in this culture of witchcraft and such, in the our culture that has built up around modern witchcraft and such, that when it comes to the culture that I'm actually from, the culture that, gifted me my language, the viewpoint that I have of the world, the stories that I know, the all of this, everything that builds up who I am, that when it comes to how that culture is presented in this witchcraft sphere, that I'm a rarity. And I find that fascinating that, that it's very rare that when you hear anybody talking about kind of Celtic culture in a very broad sense, or very specifically like looking at the cultures that come under that Celtic umbrella, when we talk about Irish traditions, Scottish traditions, Welsh traditions, Cornish traditions, it's strange to me that it's rare that it is actually coming from inside the house, so to speak, that it's instead coming from those who have read about our cultures, have said that they must have some kinship and association with these cultures because of blood or ancestry or heritage or whatever. And that kind of intrigues me and makes me wonder if voices like mine are rare, how rare are the voices from cultures that are even more suppressed, that have had even more dealings with the strangeness that is empire. Yeah, how suppressed are those voices even in this world right now? And it's a load of fuckery, as you say, the world as we see it now. And yeah, I think that's why a big part of my work is trying to make that known in hopes that it opens some people's eyes to the just absolute strangeness of that in particular, of the way in which we rarely hear from certain voices. Like you were saying, the image that we usually have of a pagan or a witchcraft author is a white male, but I always, for some reason, in my mind, especially in the modern age, if we're looking at the 21st century, I always envision an American white male as well. If you're going back to the 20th century, it gets a bit confusing because usually it's an English one, then if you go to the kind of mid 20th century. But I think as we reached the tail end of the 20th century and went into the 21st, it's changed now to an American white male. And it's really interesting when you consider that we are a subculture of people, essentially, that is predominantly populated. If my I don't know if anybody's ever done the actual statistics into it, but if I was to guess based on events I go to, based on, gatherings and such I attend, the vast majority of people within this subculture, this kind of this beating heart of witchcraft, magic, polytheism, occultism, and such, tend to be women and minorities, people who are in groups that, usually would not have a voice and such. And yet, even within our communities, even within our culture that has built up from this strangeness that is witchcraft and magic, it is still those kind of voices that we are used to seeing that rise to the top. And that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it also, I guess, makes sense, right? Like American exceptionalism, white male prioritization, especially cis white male. But it's just fascinating on that level. And of course, I also want to say that there are many cis white men whose work I really love. It's just that I try in my life to go, wait, whose voices am I not hearing from? And I've told you this before, but when you started writing and like I don't know how long ago you started writing actually, but when you started having books published, I was super excited because I was just like, here's this person embedded in culture, um, trans woman. Like you happen to be several things, but you're just also you're an excellent storyteller and you're very passionate and you're speaking from a place. And when I think about the books you've written, they're so specific, but also accessible. You write about Welshness and you write about like Celticness in your iteration and you write about the good people in your iteration and the literature of your ancestors in your iteration. And when I think sometimes about the work I've done, I think about how I'm always trying to speak from several perspectives at once. Like I'm trying to like make a place for people like myself who deeply inhabit multiple realities just because of the way I was born, where I was born, who my parents are, and my class even, and the fact that I live in ye old backwater colonial Australia, which is in fact just the colonial covering of an ancient immense landscape full of many languages that have been stolen and are currently dying because they were stolen. But I'm so in awe always of being in this place. And when I get to be with elders, and I was with an amazing elder this past weekend at this amazing lesbian wedding, and so many stories, so much lore was exchanged between us, and that just comes from friendship. Like I think the thing that I've learned the most from my practice of witchcraft is if I could say to someone like this is the thing I've learned. I've learned all kinds of things, but I've learned how to tend relationship. I've learned how to tend relationship with place, and I'm always learning, like I'm constantly learning this, but place, people, family, friends, the gods, the familiar spirits that I have, like the seasons, and also my place in history and culture. Like I'm tending to all of that. Um, yeah, and like and I feel like you're really doing that too, and you're also making more obvious and more clear some like blind spots in modern. I don't know. I don't. Yeah, culture, pagandom, witchdom. I don't know what we call it.
Oh, and that also angers people weirdly. It seems to send people into a bit of a frenzy as well because I've had a lot of pushback for things that I have said that I personally, as far as I'm aware, think are just true, are just
Yeah.
part and package of the truth.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, a lot of these voices who do speak against me particularly, but also many communities that I am part of, or communities that I like to think that I'm an ally to, and such, that there is this obsession with shouting that we are somehow incapable of accepting truth. And yet, from my perception, it almost is the other way around, that there is this lack of being able to accept the truth from those who wish to deny the truth of like various cultures and peoples that have long been ignored. So from the fact that I'm a trans person, it's like it's the truth of the reality of the complexity that is the strange world of gender and such
Mm.
and sex and the way in which that we're obsessed in the world that we are now of trying to fit the human experience into these rigid boxes, and whether we're looking at it on a biological level, whether we're looking at it on a more kind of cultural and sociological level, gender and sex are not rigid things that
No,
can be
never.
neatly compartmentalized
Yeah.
into boxes. And that's just truth
Yeah.
in the way that I perceive it, in the way that I understand it, and in the way that most professionals understand it. And yet so many people can't accept that truth, and yet the way in which they argue against those of us who exist beyond those binaries and such is that we can't accept truth, that we can't accept and acknowledge truth. And I find that just ironic, I suppose, that the way that they're arguing against it is that we have an issue with truth and fact when the truth and fact of it is that things are complex, things are messy, things are kaleidoscopic, as I said earlier. And
Yeah.
similarly, when, I present about my own culture, I try when I do my work to speak from a place of experience predominantly
Yes.
rather than a place of study and research only. It's not
Yeah.
just something I've read about, but something I know, something I've
Yes.
I've experienced throughout my life. And that sometimes means that I say things that will irk people because I'll mention like, oh, there is this book that's written in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s even that mentions this thing that they claim is from Welsh culture, but it's a misunderstanding and it's not from Welsh culture at all. This is the truth of it. And that can irk people because it kind of shatters the reality that they have. And it can be something as so silly and so redundant as, the way that we pronounce a certain word or the connections that do or do not exist between certain concepts and ideas and things that are very apparent in modern paganism. If you want an example of it, it's the whole, discourse surrounding like map-on and such, which I always find really hilarious that there is even a discourse at all, and that people refer to it as the map-on discourse every year. Because from my perspective as a Welsh person, it's just that this is a word from our culture. not just a word, but a name of a deity, of a figure from our mythology and our culture. And they have nothing to do with the way in which it is
Totally.
utilized today in modern paganism. And for some reason, that angers people when I mention
Yeah,
that,
it really
even though
does.
it's
Even
and
yeah,
it's baffling.
it is baffling, and I've tried to like be really clear. It's like, yeah, I used to use that term associated with the autumn equinox, and then I realized what it was, and personally chose to just study who that was in that context, and then move on. And so there was like a transition few years where, and I was even mispronouncing it. Like the books were telling me to say Mabon, not Marbon or Marbon. And so like I was totally being told to mispronounce it by people who were not Welsh speakers, not culturally Welsh, in books where they had authority. And then of course we know it's from Aidan Kelly because he decided that, oh, I want a name, a Celtic or Germanic name, and he's written about this for a stolen child because at this time of year we celebrate Kore. It's like, what the fuck? Like, I'm mind blown by that. Anyway, enough about him. But and then just like we tried when I realized what it was, my covenant at the time was like, let's actually work with that myth at that time of year and see if it works. And so we worked with that myth and the five animals, and we did like possession work and sacred theater work. And we did that for 3 years or so, beautiful work. But then I noticed at Evernest that like so what that meant to me, and we didn't push for it. No, what that meant for me was that clearly that didn't belong there. Like and we let it go. And for me, that mystery that your culture calls Marbon, that I do have a place for that mystery in my heart, but I don't need to place it on a wheel. I mean, if anywhere, as I think you would probably maybe say this, correct me if I'm wrong, some people would say, oh, maybe that's more of a midwinter thing. But like again, it's like not really like it doesn't need to go anywhere. Like so for me, that mystery of a child, the son of the great mother, um, there's a mystery there for me, and I can meditate on that mystery and be with that mystery. But yeah, and some of my traditions do have, I mean, we have to wrap this up in a minute, but I want to talk to you for 5 more hours. But, I know you once I'd love to hear you speak more about this publicly, maybe. I think you talked about this at a festival I wasn't able to be at, but there is so much Welsh influence on witchcraft tradition, like everywhere. Like, like I can, like all, maybe Wildwood is less influenced. Like, I don't know how much Welsh influence we have in that. But if I think about Anderson Fairy, which is one of the roots of reclaiming, and I think about the other tradition I'm involved in, drenched in Welsh mythos, drenched in Welsh lore. And then I think about, certain iterations of what Gardner taught and Sanders taught, and I'm like, you can see it there too pretty clearly. And maybe sometimes it's just a name or a word, but then it's like, why is that there? And so and then also so many Welsh traditions in the US, like that even call themselves Welsh traditions. And I'm sure they're earnest as fuck, diligent as fuck people. But I'm sure also there's a lot of confusion going on.
Yeah, it's something that I try and bring up in my work is the way in which, a lot of what we get from modern witchcraft today comes from these sources. And, it'd be nice if we got a nod sometimes if people were like, oh, let's just acknowledge where this comes from. In the same way that, we acknowledged the land that we're standing upon at the beginning and such. Just a little like, oh yeah, it comes from here. And it probably evolved and changed over time, and that's fine. And I think people have this mindset that if you, like, I'm very open about saying, hey, these are the Welsh influences, and I can spot them because I recognize them from my culture. So, like, I blew someone's mind once at a festival I went to because we were talking about the concept of initiation and the way that initiation shows up in modern pagan and witchcraft spaces. And we were talking about the idea of the year and a day, why it's a year and a day. And I remember just, asking someone, why do you think it's a year and a day? Where does that come from? What or do you think that influence is? And this was somebody who was initiated Gardnerian Wiccan, so they'd gone through their year and a day and such. And I asked them, what is the year and the day, the significance to you? And I was asking because I wanted to know, is there something more to it?
Yeah.
Because I'm not Wiccan and I've
Yeah.
not gone through that year and a day kind of thing.
Yeah, you
So I
weren't
was like,
tricking
is
them.
there? yeah, is there more to it that they can tell me? And I don't know if their oaths
Yeah.
restricted them from being able to say anything, but they essentially were just telling me, I don't know, it just is, it just is a year and a day. And I said, because I find it interesting because in, the mythology surrounding Ceridwen, she takes a year and a day to brew the potion
Yeah.
of Awen.
Yeah.
So could it be drawn from that mythological source? And she just kind of looked at me and kind of, you could watch the mind-blowing kind of going on with her face as I said that. Like she was connecting dots that she
Mm.
hadn't connected before. Because this was also somebody who considers herself quite a lover of Welsh mythology as well. So she was like, "Oh my goodness, how did I never make that connection between this and that?" And it can be tiny things like that that I pick up on. I'm like, "Oh, I connect that to Ceridwen, but is that actually where Wicca gets it? I don't know." And sometimes when I say these things to people, when I'm like, "Oh, do you think that perhaps this comes from this source
Mm.
because I recognize it from my own culture and such?" There are some people who I think then think I'm trying to lay claim on that
Yes.
or
Yeah.
trying to say you're not allowed to do that anymore, actually, because I'm Welsh. It's the same with the whole Mabon, Mabon discourse. Because like it's interesting that the two loudest voices, I would say, who come from Wales, who talk about this are me and Christopher Hughes.
Yeah.
And both of us, when we've talked about Mabon, we've both said we don't really care if you
Mm.
want to call the autumn equinox
Mm.
Mabon. We would prefer you use the actual pronunciation and that you somehow give a little bit of a nod to who he
Yes.
is.
Yes.
But it's up to you how you do your thing. That's just a request we're making. But people get their knickers really in a twist about us even saying that much, just saying, hey, can you please try and pronounce it correctly and maybe respect the culture it comes from? And that just angers people. And I don't understand it because to us, it's just a humble request. Please acknowledge this culture that has long been looked over and
Yeah.
ignored. So yeah, it intrigues me the way that, just something as simple as us sharing our truth and our experience can anger people and how much that is reflected in all of this on a greater scale as well, not just for us, but for people from various cultures who have had a hand in influencing the way in which witchcraft exists in the modern spheres today.
What a marvelous ending. I love that. Thank you so much. Like that made my mind spiral into so many ways, but I was like, another time. Thank you so much, Mara. I love this kind of I just love conversations like this that are just like fluid and were not planned. And I just find so much in that. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yay.